Let's move to Matthew 19 and 20. And having said that, we have two chapters here on the journey narrative, much more briefly stated than in Luke, because Matthew has that expanded Galilean ministry section where a lot of the journey materials are included, and that's fine. But since we have done so much with what's in Matthew 19 already in the Luke narrative, we will just skip over chapter 19 and go right to 20. Unless some of you want to bring up something, it would be kind of repetitious, but it might be, in fact, useful if you did. Let's go to chapter 20 unless there's any objections. And there you have the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. It's one of those unique parables of Matthew, and you know the details of the story, I'm sure. But what's the point? All right, just briefly stated, you know that some began work early in the morning, like 6 a.m. when the day technically began, and they worked 12 hours till 6 p.m. Others began at 9 a.m. and worked 9 hours. Others came at noon and worked 6 hours. And, you know, the final group that was hired came in the 11th hour. In other words, 5 p.m. and they checked out at 6 p.m. And they get called forward first to get their paycheck, and they all get the same. What's the point of this parable? Well, before we talk about the point of the parable, let me digress for a moment. Parables are usually of one kind or another. Almost all parables are either parables that tell us about how God operates or how we should deal with our neighbor. You know, those are the two commandments, love God and love your neighbor. And so some parables do relate to how God operates his kingdom, and others deal with how we live out our life under God. Like, for example, the Good Samaritan. This is how you treat your neighbor. Or some other parables that deal with how we live out our lives ethically. Okay? But this parable here about the laborers in the vineyard is not about how you should treat your workers. In other words, if they only work 1 hour, show them favoritism. If they work all day long, all life long, I mean, make them grunt for every ounce of energy they put out. And that's not the point at all. This is a parable that shows how God is. And how is God? Well, God is one who keeps his promises. They had all been negotiated with for a day's wage, and they all agreed this is fair. And the point is, God always treats his people fairly, without exception. No complaint. But surprisingly, he most often deals with us in a generous way that is far beyond our comprehension. Like, for example, people who came at the very end of the day. And that's what the grace of God is like. We can't explain it. It's far beyond us. Why Jesus should care about a skunk like me when there's multi-millions of others who have lived already and who might even be more holy, like Mother Teresa and a few others. Okay, you can name them. I'm not going to do that. But you get the point here. God is true to his promises, and his grace is such that it is most surprising. And that's the point of the parable. How God is. He's gracious. His kingdom, how is his kingdom? Well, you have some parables of the kingdom in Matthew 13, like the pearl of great price. You know, it's so precious that there couldn't be anything more precious. Or it's like the mustard seed, which is so tiny, like, you know, the kingdom of God started off most humbly with Jesus gathering just a few people around him, but in time it exploded all over the Mediterranean world and worldwide eventually. That's what the kingdom is like. Okay, so this is that kind of a parable, what God is like. And we shouldn't begrudge his generosity. As verse 15 points out, the last will be first and the first will be last. In fact, we should thank him for his generosity because we're all recipients of it, assuming that we attach to him. Okay. The chapter has two other accounts, which I think we have previously covered. But there's something unique about how Matthew covers some of these stories. So I would like to just point out that when the sons of Zebedee, in chapter 20, verse 20 and following, make their case through their mother that they might be seated at the right hand in glory, one to the right, one to the left of Jesus in his kingdom. The numeral 2 is indicated here. And you say, big deal. Well, in the other accounts, of course, you have the sons of Zebedee, but the numeral 2 is not used. And why do I say that? Well, you go on to verse 29, and we have 2 blind men begging at Jericho, and all the other evangelists, when they tell about the Bartimaeus story, Bartimaeus is not mentioned by name here, but here it's 2 blind men. And you've seen previously, like in Matthew 8 and 9, you had 2 demoniacs, where the other gospel writers speak about 1 demoniac cured and the pigs getting the demons and going into the sea. And Matthew in chapter 9 having 2 blind men again, which is very parallel to this story. And of course, when you get to the next chapter, you have 2 animals that Jesus rides. You know, you say, what's Matthew doing here? Well, let's stay tuned, and we'll talk about that tomorrow, because that's in the Holy Week story, and I think it has some significance, and it's worth discussing. There's a very important theological point here, which is beautiful the way that Matthew captures it. Well, maybe I should let the cat out of the bag right away and say that Matthew doubles things, and this way he emphasizes something that's very important that you don't want to miss, and pay careful attention to it, get the point of it, get the lesson of it, so he doubles, okay? And that gets us out of some of the hassles when people like to say, oh, this is contradiction. Not a contradiction at all, because Matthew uses this technique in order to sharpen his point. And this occurs throughout Matthew on many points, as you've seen. I've just given you some illustrations of that. Okay. Anything else on the journey before we leave it behind? We might do a transition piece at this point, as I already alerted you to do. And from your handouts from our opening day, will you pull out that sheet, first of all, that lists the M and L materials, M referring to those accounts that are found uniquely in Matthew, and L, those referring to the Lucan accounts. And I don't want to push this too hard because you've got plenty of things on your plate already, but exams being what they are, sometimes you want to pay some attention because, well, let's face it, you are sometimes held to some of these things. What's unique about Matthew? Well, you see a few things. When you look at the birth story, for example, the Magi, it's only in Matthew. When you look at the birth story in Luke, the 12-year-old in the temple, the boy Jesus in chapter 2, that's only in Luke. Okay, Luke also has John the Baptist and Jesus' birth announced in advance to the future parents with the message from the angel Gabriel. So there are some unique aspects there. We've talked about that previously. Going back to Matthew, you have about 4 things listed there in chapter 13. You know, a lot of unique parables. Matthew has 2 sets of parables. The parable of the weeds and the wheat and the parable of the net have the same point. Namely, let God be the judge. Do not separate the weeds from the wheat. Do not separate the good fish from the bad. God ultimately, when he comes on the last day, will say, you go to heaven and you go to hell because of your, connection with me previously or not. And likewise, the parable of the hidden treasure and the pearl have a similar point. They both deal with the preciousness of having that which is more worthy than anything else. The pearl of great price, of course, refers to the gospel, and the hidden treasure, likewise, is the gospel. Hang on to it, and don't let it get out of your hands. Get it at any price. So those are unique to Matthew. The temple tax, that wouldn't surprise you because Matthew was a tax collector, right? You might expect him to talk about taxes. He does. We talked about the workers in the vineyard just a few minutes ago, those who labored only an hour as opposed to those who worked all day. And then, please note carefully that little scribble in the right-hand side of the page. When we get to our readings for tomorrow, you will find some very fascinating stories about the resurrection at the end of chapter 27 and beginning of chapter 28, about that earthquake there. Matthew only tells about that earthquake and about how the dead rise and then don't come out of the tombs until after Jesus does, okay? But in connection with the crucifixion, the earthquake opens the tombs, and the way Matthew tells the story, they came forth into the city and were seen in connection with, after Jesus' own resurrection. And in a sense, this kind of relates to what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, that Jesus becomes the first fruits of those who slept. You see that connection there? It's a neat little illustration. Matthew gives that to us. Then the guards. The Jews insisted upon putting guards at the tomb, and even so, Jesus still rose. And then the guards were bribed. I'm sorry, the guards weren't bribed, but the guards were told, we'll bribe Pilate if you get in trouble, okay? So just say the disciples stole the body away. Matthew gives us those things uniquely. What about Luke? Well, we spent a lot of time on Luke already today, so maybe just a few things would be enough. You will notice that from chapter 9 to 19, you've got a huge list of things that are unique to Luke. And if I want to keep you from going crazy, I'll just mention the 2 or 3 things instead of all of these. Okay, but all of these are unique to Luke. Well, we already mentioned he's got 2 sending accounts, chapter 9 and 10, sending of the 12 and sending of the 70 disciples. There's a Good Samaritan in chapter 10, and we've got the rich man and poor Lazarus in chapter 16, and we've got the prodigal son in chapter 15, the lost son. Actually, there's 2 lost sons. The older brother was just as lost, even more so lost. We've got Zacchaeus in chapter 19. All right, let that be enough. But anyway, you might just note that each of the gospel writers has some of their own recollections that they choose to include for the purposes of bringing the good news to their particular audience. Okay, any questions on that page? Let me comment on the other page that looks like this, with those boxes, and that has some notes in particular about Luke and John, where we spent a lot of time today and still will spend more time today. And then also dealing with how the 4 gospel writers can be compared. Don't take this too rigidly, please. It'll be helpful, I think, but we shouldn't have to press it. For example, Matthew was written initially, it seems, to Jews because of his focus on the fulfillment. But in a larger sense, it's written for all of us, for our learning. Mark seems to be focused originally to the Romans, but again, not limited to them. Luke seems to focus on the Greeks because of his huge Gentile focus in his narrative, okay? John seems to be written to a wider circle at a later time as a supplement to the other Gospels to correct some of the issues that had arisen in the early days of the church. And so John does not need to repeat many of the stories in his mind. He gives us some new stories that are not found in other Gospels. And until we get to Holy Week, there is just a lot of unique material in John's Gospel written for Christians in general in order to prove to them unmistakably that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Christ who is coming into the world, and that believing you might have life in his name. So that's at the very end of chapter 20, verse 31, where you find that theme for John's Gospel. Now, again, the second column, Jesus as Messiah, yes, he is the one who was promised of old, as the Scriptures had pictured it. In Mark, you have the miracle worker, the can-do Savior, the mighty one. That's a focus. And in Luke, you have certainly the caring quality that is focused on most heavily He reaches out to all the outcast groups. He came to save sinners, whom I am chief, St. Paul would say, and he refers, I'm sure, to me as well. The caring Savior, the one who reaches out to those nobody else cares about, really. And then finally, for John, you see the need to prove to the doubters of his time, who were being misled by other teachers, that Jesus truly is the Son of God. He is not a mere man, but he is also the Son of God. Okay, now the third column again. Matthew obviously has 5 great discourses. He's got other things as well, but we remember that, and so we do in John's Gospel. He's got some of the great discourses connected with the miracle stories, which John calls signs. In Luke, we saw so many parables. In Matthew, we saw so many miracles. Again, this is not to be looked at rigidly, but kind of a trend. And so on it goes. All right, so we don't have to go through the whole list. You can read it yourself, whatever it's worth for you. Obviously, Luke has other informants other than Paul. We don't know who they all were. We may assume that he probably interviewed the Virgin Mary to get some of those first-hand accounts about the birth of Jesus and other stories, like the 12-year-old in the temple. I would even know, but we don't know who all the informants were, but this is just kind of a general way of getting a little bit of a handle how each of the gospel writers has something unique, something valuable to add to the other gospels that are out there. Okay, as far as the rest of the page is concerned, I'll leave this to you for whatever it's worth. It's a little bit of a review thing for you. We haven't touched on John yet in any significant way, so we'll look at the bottom of the page a little bit more as a way of leading into the Gospel of John. The son of Zebedee is the likely author, although he is never mentioned by name in the Gospel, but in itself, that's a strong argument for his authorship, because it would be unthinkable for him not to be mentioned if he didn't write the book, okay? Because, a lot of the other apostles are mentioned, and there's no question that John is one of the leading disciples. After all, we do have extra-biblical evidence that Mary was taken care of by John in her old age, and we have the record at the cross where Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son," and to the, quote, beloved disciple, whoever that might be, he says, "Behold your mother," okay? Who is the beloved disciple? Well, of course, if you put everything together, it's pretty unmistakable. It must be John, the son of Zebedee. And so, from early times, there was really no significant dispute, although in later times, people write all kinds of things. After all, they do have to get their doctorate somehow, and they come up with a new theory, which they, well, all right, I'm not going to go into that. You can get into trouble for that. I don't mind trouble as long as it's good trouble. Okay, good trouble? Anyway, John largely omits parables. Later, if we have time, we'll look at some of these marvelous lists in the Concordia Study Bible. They have some marvelous review lists for us where they also list parables and miracles and other good things. John doesn't have any of them listed because, well, he has another approach. He gives us discourses connected with miracles, the few that he has. Some of the key themes, so, well, we have the I am statements, and probably tomorrow I will list them all for you, if not today. And then some of the key themes that come out of John's Gospel are listed there. He deals heavily with these concepts, but he uses these concepts in the light of the mission of Jesus, and that's what makes his Gospel special.